All right, so have you ever like been cruising along, feeling pretty good about your Spanish, and then bam, irregular verbs totally throw you off?
Yeah, it's a classic struggle. I mean, every Spanish learner's been there. Those verbs can be tricky.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I remember one time I was in Spain trying to order a coffee, feeling super confident. I think I said something like, "Quiero un café, por favor."
Yeah.
The barista just got chuckling and goes, "Quieras decir que?"
Oh, I can only imagine the look on your face. It's amazing how one little mistake can really throw you off.
Total face palm moment. But hey, it was a good lesson. I knew I had to conquer those verbs. So that's what this deep dive is all about, the wild world of Spanish irregular verbs. We'll unpack the tricky patterns, uncover those connections to Latin, and hopefully help everyone avoid a coffee ordering mishap or two.
Sounds good. And, you might be surprised to learn that many of these so-called irregularities, they're not actually random at all. A lot of them come from how the language evolved, with roots going way back to Latin.
Okay, so it's like that friend we all have who never quite follows the rules, but they're a blast once you get to know them. We just need to understand their quirks.
Exactly. And sometimes those quirks are just about keeping things sounding right. Let's start with a few that aren't true irregularities, more like spelling adjustments.
All right, break it down for me. What kind of spelling adjustments are we talking about?
Well, you know how Spanish spelling is usually very consistent when it comes to pronunciation?
Right.
Sometimes the spelling of a verb needs a little tweak to maintain that consistent sound.
Gotcha. So it's less about the verb being grammatically irregular and more about the spelling rules.
Exactly. For instance, the verb tocar, meaning to touch. Remember how some letters change sounds depending on what vowel follows them? To keep that hard C sound before an E in the we touch form, tocamolis, the C becomes Q.
Ah, that makes sense. So it's not the verb's fault, really. It's just trying to follow the rules of Spanish pronunciation.
Exactly. And you'll find similar patterns with other consonants. Z changing to CG becoming J, or gu switching to gual for that consistent pronunciation.
Okay, that's reassuring. So some irregularities are just about keeping the sounds consistent, but I know things can get a bit trickier with things like diphthongs, right?
Yeah, diphthongs are where things get really interesting.
For those of us who might need a refresher, what exactly are diphthongs again?
Good point. A diphthong is basically a sound made when two vowels are right next to each other in the same syllable. Think of the I sound in bien, meaning well, or the ua in agua, meaning water.
Right, those double vowel combos. But how do those work with irregular verbs?
Here's the thing, some verbs just love those diphthongs in certain forms while others wouldn't be caught dead with them. It's all about knowing which verbs are in which camp.
Okay, so it's not enough to just know the diphthong sounds. I have to learn which verbs use them. Ay, caramba.
You got it. Take the verb pensar, to think. You have pienso, piensas, piensa. Notice how the E slips into a I when stressed. It's a classic diphthong move.
So it's all about the stress, like a little vowel power play.
You could say that. And the same thing happens with contar, to count. You get cuento, cuentas, cuenta, that hue diphthong loves the spotlight. But then you have verbs like comer or beber, which would never even think about using a diphthong, even when the stress is on the E.
So it's like a secret club. Some verbs are in, some are out.
You could put it that way. And to make things even more interesting, there's another type of vowel shift we need to talk about, vowel raising. Instead of two vowels blending, we have an E or an O feeling a little ambitious in certain forms.
Vowel raising. Okay, you've definitely got my attention.
Yeah.
Give me an example of how that works.
Imagine those vowels are on this ladder, right? You've got like E on one rung and then E a couple of steps higher and O hanging out with its buddy, U a few rungs up. Now picture this in certain verb forms. Those vowels get a sudden burst of energy and decide to climb.
Okay, I'm kind of digging this vowel ladder analogy. So the E wants to be like the I, and the O is reaching for the U. But why? What motivates them to make that leap?
It's all about the stress, that emphasis we put on certain syllables. It's like the stress gives those vowels that extra push to reach for a higher sound. For instance, take the verb sentir, meaning to feel. You have siento, sientes, so far so good, right? But then, bam, it shifts to sentio in the third-person preterite that he saw its chance and climbed up to become an I.
Wow, sneaky vowel. So
Yeah.
it's not random at all. It's the stress that makes them reach for those higher vowel sounds.
Yeah.
But how am I supposed to remember which verbs are going to have their vowels scrambling up the ladder?
Don't worry, it becomes second nature with practice. And a good thing to remember is that this vowel raising often happens in the same predictable spots, like the third-person preterite, just like you saw with sentir. Another example is dormir, to sleep, which morphs into duermo, duermes, dormio. That O just couldn't resist the allure of the U when the stress hit.
This reminds me of that coffee incident again. Not only did I mess up the diphthong and queer verb, but I also stumbled over the vowel change in poder when I tried to say I can't decide. I think it's something like no puedo decidir instead of no puedo decidir.
Really? Oh, yeah. I've totally been there. Those little vowel changes can really trip you up. It's like they know when you're feeling unsure and decide to have a little fun at your expense.
Exactly. But you know what? Now that we're breaking it down like this, I'm starting to see the method to the madness. These vowel shifts aren't just random occurrences. They follow patterns.
Exactly. And that's the key to unlocking the mystery of irregular verbs, recognizing those patterns. So are you ready to decode some more?
Bring it on. I'm feeling like a vowel detective now, ready to crack the case wide open. What other secrets are these verbs hiding?
Let's move on to a couple of notorious gangs in the irregular verb world, the G verbs and the ZC verbs. They like to hang out in different parts of the conjugation table and have their own unique ways of causing a stir.
Ooh, G verbs and ZC verbs. It sounds like we're about to infiltrate some top-secret linguistic operation. What makes these groups so special?
Well, imagine these verbs having their own exclusive clubhouses. And nobody gets in without following the house rules. The G verbs, for instance, have this thing about adding an extra G in certain situations. Like they want to make sure, they're the ones in charge.
An extra G?
Yeah.
Tell me they at least have the courtesy to use it in the same place every time.
They're not that chaotic. Think of the verb salir, to leave, a classic G verb. You've got yo salgo tu, sals. See that G sneaking in there? It's like their calling card. And it happens in other forms, too, like salga in the subjunctive.
So it's like a secret handshake?
Mm-hmm.
Only the G verbs know the moves?
Yeah.
Do all the other G verbs follow this added G rule?
You bet. It's their way of standing out from the crowd. Take valor, to be worth, for instance. You get yo valgo. Or how about tenor, to have? Yep, it joins the club with you tongo. Even punter, to put. It wouldn't miss out on the fun with you pongo.
Wow, so there's definitely a system to their madness. It's like they have a secret code that we're finally cracking. But I have a feeling it can't be that easy, right? What about those ZC verbs? Are they just as predictable?
Oh, the ZC verbs are a different breed. They're all about swapping out a C for a Z when you least expect it.
Okay, now we're talking serious code-breaking ZC verbs, swapping C for Z. It's like they're speaking their own language.
Right. It's like their own little linguistic puzzle. Think of the verb nacer, to be born, a classic ZC verb. You have yo nasco, tu naces. See how that Z just pops up right in the middle? It's like their signature move.
Okay, Z instead of C. Is that the extent of their trickery, or are there more surprises up their sleeves?
Oh, they always like to keep us on our toes. Creaser, to grow, another ZC verb, it becomes yo kretsko. And conazo, to know, morphs into yo conozco. It's like they have a whole secret language going on.
So if I'm following correctly, G verbs add a G, like a secret password, and ZC verbs swap into Z, like some kind of hidden code. It's like a verb espionage thriller. But tell me, it can't just be present tense where they pull these tricks. What about those past tense forms? Don't tell me those are irregular too.
We've only just scratched the surface of irregular preterites. Some verbs, including many of those G verbs we talked about, completely switch up their stems in the preterite tense. It's like they enter a whole new dimension.
Stem switcheroo in the past tense. Now that sounds seriously next level.
It might seem like a lot, but here's the good news, that irregular stem is the same for all the related tenses. Think of a star, which becomes estuve, estuviste, estuvo, and so on. Or andar, which transforms into anduve, anduviste, anduvo.
So it's like learning a whole new verb just for the past tense.
In a way, yes. But remember, a lot of these irregular preterites come from Latin, so by learning them, you're actually connecting with the ancient roots of the language.
Wow, that's actually really interesting. It's like each irregular verb is a little time traveler carrying a piece of history.
Exactly. And speaking of time travelers, we can't forget about those past participles. Some of them have those irregular forms, too often called strong participles, because they like to stand out from the crowd.
Right, like puesto and deco. These are such common words. It's easy to forget they're actually irregular past participles breaking all the rules.
Precisely. They like to keep us on our toes. Just like with those other irregular forms, once you start recognizing these strong participles, you'll see the patterns and connections, and they won't seem so random anymore.
This has been quite the adventure. I feel like we've explored the jungle of Spanish irregular verbs, deciphered their secret codes, and come out on the other side. What would you say are the most important things to keep in mind when navigating this wild world of verbs?
Don't be intimidated. Yes, there are rules, and sometimes those rules get broken. But there are patterns and logic behind it all. Embrace the history. A lot of these irregularities are rooted in Latin, which adds such a cool layer to the language. And lastly, practice, practice, practice. The more you use these verbs in context, the more natural they'll become.
I love that. It's like anything else we learn. It might seem overwhelming at first, but with a little effort, we can master those irregular verbs. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Spanish irregular verbs. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into those languages.